en esta sección tenemos a dos grandes invitados internacionales, dos distinguidos representantes en lo que es tema de innovación en lo que es el sector público. Y vamos a dar la palabra primero al señor Christian Bason, director del MindLab de Dinamarca. Él tendrá un espacio de 35 minutos para exponer y después vendrán las preguntas por parte del público. Señor Bason, adelante.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's very impressive to see so many people assembled here today, engaged in the question of public sector innovation in Chile. And what I've heard so far, I think, witnesses there's a lot of political will, there's a lot of will from the administrative side for making more innovation, more and better innovation happen. What I've heard so far, I think, is at a very, very high level of reflection and recognition of the challenges that it entails. So in some way, I don't really think you need me to say anything else. And that being said, I would say, of course, that you know what we're talking about here is not easy. That's definitely one thing I've learned in the last 8 or 10 years I've been working in this field. I would also say, as an introduction, that you know there are no simple solutions to complex problems, and labs are, I believe, part of the solution, but it's not the only thing. There's no such thing as a silver bullet. As we say. So the question, of course, is what is the contribution that labs might make, rather than how it's going to solve everything. So we've had a trend today of quoting Jeff Mulgan, Chief Executive of Nesta in the UK, and I will also quote Jeff. He's good for some of the more powerful quotes around this field, and has also been an active person in the field as a head of the strategy unit in the UK government, and now running the UK's Innovation Foundation. And I think this quote is interesting, because we all know what brutal and stupid government look like, also in my country. But what does it mean to be the best? You know, that's why we're here today. What does it mean to be the best? And that's the difficult part. What does being best mean? And what I'll try to share with you are some reflections about my learning, but also some reflections about where we're seeing this field going. So what I'll say today, it will be a little bit different than what I've been discussing with colleagues over the last couple of days. So today there's a blog post that I wrote. It's on our website at MindLab, and in that blog post I'm mentioning these two books. The book to the left is the new book by the former foreign minister of the US, where he spends 400 pages writing about the new world order and what's wrong with it and how difficult a situation our world is in. And the book to the right is a new book by the chief editor of the Financial Times, on what went wrong with the financial crisis and a few ideas about what to do about it. The reason I'm mentioning these two books is that when the magazine The Economist did a review of the books, and they did that just a few weeks ago, they mentioned that Henry Kissinger's book is 400 pages long and has 4 pages of recommendations only. Imagine, and they're saying that the recommendations are a little bit fluffy and difficult to understand and don't help that much. And Martin Wolf's book has a few more pages of recommendations, but still are not very detailed, difficult to understand, and won't perhaps help that much. So the question I'm asking is, are we spending too much time on analysis and understanding the problem and too little time on trying to fix it? What if Henry Kissinger had spent 200 pages in his book using his network of former statesmen and diplomats and thinkers to really look into what should we do? Imagine there were 200 pages of that in that book. So don't laugh, but there's a new book coming out that I've edited, and it doesn't have the answer to that. It's called Design for Policy. But what it does try to do is to say, what are the ways in which we can work in government to be more forward-looking? Because the legacy that Henry Kissinger and Martin Wolf are showing us is also the legacy we've inherited in government, to be very, very smart and very, very analytical, but not very good at action, and not very good at working systematically with change. And that's actually why we're here, isn't it? It's because we recognize that the challenges we're facing in our societies, for our children, for our people in hospitals, for our unemployed, those challenges are challenges we actually recognize quite well. I mean, we all know them, and they're not new, by the way. They are, most of them, what we characterize as wicked problems that have been with us for quite a while. Maybe they're getting worse, maybe they're getting a little bit better. But the reason we're here is we are struggling to find ways, keeping up with ways of addressing them. So in this new book that's coming out soon, I've had help from about 18 thinkers and practitioners in policy and in academia across the world. And just to highlight a few of the insights is that we are seeing problems that are becoming super wicked. They're becoming even more interdependent. They're becoming even more complex. They cross borders. They got to do with our environment. They've got to do with the very social fabric of our countries. We saw earlier a wonderful photograph of what silos might look like, and we don't just have organizational silos in government that are out of tune, or out of touch with society and the way people experience services and systems over time. We also have siloed knowledge domains where professions such as engineering or political science or law or economics or environmental sciences have a very big difficulty in talking with each other. They're very good at analysis, each of them, but they're not very good at synthesis, working together to find solutions. And we also have inherited governments, and in spite of what I heard earlier today about the shift happening when you have new political leadership come in, we have administrations, certainly, and bureaucracies that prioritize stability over change and are built to their very foundational core to prioritize stability. And of course, we do also need stable institutions in our societies. I definitely also recognize that. But how do we then deal with the paradox of managing change and stability at the same time? And one of the things in our book that is being mentioned as a positive movement that might help is that there's this new trend around the opening of government, driven by opening up data, opening up policy processes, and this whole discussion we're having today about more citizen-centered ways of working with innovation. So there are some signs that this open government movement may be, in a broad sense, sort of at a meta level, something we can leverage and use. Just like citizen-centric always sounds good, open almost always sounds good, doesn't it? So the challenge, of course, is that governments are the ones who own the problems, and policies are the ones we pursue to address them. And so what I'll talk about today is the ways in which the profession of policymaking might need to change, and also the links between policymaking, service design, and the rise of innovation labs. What are those entities, and how are they able to perhaps help us? So, in Denmark, we are right now implementing the largest reform of our public school system in a generation. And I know there are a few people here in the room that are a little bit interested also in school reform in this country. If there's ever was a wicked problem, it's school reform. The challenge we have in Denmark is how do we implement a school reform with a lot of good intentions when our Minister for Education realizes this? Actually, when she suggested to join MindLab and be part of our circle of owners, this is one of the things she said to me, and one of the things she wanted us to help with. This is a very, very big step for a minister to recognize that success in politics is not just getting the law adopted. And I have another example. This is from her permanent secretary, so that's the senior bureaucrat working directly under her. If you recognize this as a public servant, then you ask yourself, what are the ways in which we can assure that a reform actually leads to change when we're not in control of the system that is going to deliver the reform? And so in Denmark, these recognitions, and I hear some of the same reflections here in Chile, are the ones that are driving our work to rethink how we do policy and rethink how we do public services. So really what is at stake is our ability to take visions of change and hopes for change and turn them into reality. And that is really the innovation challenge. So some of the ways forward that we have worked on for now quite a long time is, first of all, to recognize that no policy, however visionary, arrives on a blank slate, arrives on a ground zero. There's always something going on. People, organizations, actors in society are busy doing things. They're always part of the picture. And we're recognizing that understanding people's behavior in very qualitative, in-depth ways is really the key to good policy design, and should be part of design from the beginning to the end. We're recognizing the special skills and environments we're talking about today at labs that might help turn insights about behavior into action. And we're also recognizing that when we're dealing with complex interdependent systems, no amount of analysis will do the trick. No amount of analysis. The only way to understand what works in a complex societal system is to try things out, to test, to experiment. This summer I was in the Danish island of Bornholm at a big democracy gathering with 40,000 Danes are gathering to celebrate Danish democracy with politicians, with organizations, and many, many citizens. And we had a small session on the education reform, and I said to my colleagues, the policymakers in the Danish government, you know, this reform, which we're doing for 500,000 children across Denmark, a small country, we only have 500,000 kids in school, this reform we're doing is really one big experiment. We've never done it before. It's the first time we've ever done this. In 2014, this reform, it's the first time. And they looked at me like I was crazy and said, yes, well, we know it's an experiment, but you can't say that. What do you think the journalists would say? What do you think the press would say? The Danish Minister of Education is experimenting with 500,000 children. But of course, that's what we're doing. So the question is, what would it take if we recognize that what we are doing in policymaking is experimentation? What are smart ways of experimenting? So you don't experiment on the whole population, but you actually start maybe experimenting at smaller scale first to learn. So what are the links between policy, services, and what is it that labs can do? Definitely, we're seeing governments recognize that there are things they must do differently, and innovation labs are ways they're trying to do that. We've seen labs also start and shut down again, so there's no guarantee for success. We are seeing a lot of learning happening, and the question for labs, I think, in many ways is to learn fast enough to stay relevant. Here's a map of some of the labs. This map is almost already out of date because, for example, DesignGov down on the bottom right corner, which is in Australia, does not exist anymore. And at the same time, of course, we very soon will need to update it with Chile and put you on the map. The role we play at MindLab, working with, currently actually 4 ministries. 3 of them are here: the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Employment, the Ministry of Business, and we're also working with the Ministry of the Interior, is to work with our owners to create public value, or co-create public value, which means that we have a different relationship than a hierarchical one, where we're also in a position to challenge and question policymakers, and sometimes to be a little bit disruptive in that process. We spend a lot of our time interviewing, observing, doing field research with citizens, but we also spend a very big amount of our time simply processing ideas and insights together with our colleagues across government organizations within the system. And it can be emphasized enough, I think, that labs have a role of being partners and colleagues with civil servants in a respectful conversation about what might work, what might we change, and really taking that analytical capability and turning it into more actionable ideas. So the way we think about where we're positioned is really in a way to help shortcut the system and take citizen insight all the way through up to the top level and back again, and to work across different silos or different domains. So this is one way of sort of viewing where we are positioned in the Danish context. And in many ways, that is the position that most labs at national level would find themselves in. But what are the tools and what are the approaches and what are the skills? And just very briefly to share that with you before moving on to the question of design for policymaking. This is the competency model that we have, and where we are quite clear that we need to be able to build and invest in different skills and different competencies that you normally would find in government. So beyond public policy and administration, we have skills in qualitative research, ethnographic research, anthropology, skills in design, and I'll get more into what we mean by design in government. And then we have supporting skill sets that are critical in driving concrete innovation work, project management, facilitation, and recognizing that what we're dealing with is really, in many ways, redesigning organizations. If you want any citizen to ever experience anything different as they encounter public services, then we in the system need to redesign what we're doing. We need to change our processes before they can experience a different process. And that's something that's often not recognized. Sometimes, policymakers think, well, we should just educate citizens to be, smarter and understand what we're doing to them. But it's us who have to change. And over time, we built this model. It's reflected in many, many different types of innovation models globally, so it's not unique as such. This is just the way we articulate it, but where we work with processes both about knowing and understanding citizens' lives and realities, about analyzing what does that mean and bringing that analytical capability, but then synthesizing into concepts, ideas, prototypes, suggestions that integrate multiple knowledge domains, different professions, different levels of government, citizens' own knowledge into ideas, and then creating solutions that will hopefully make a difference to them in practice. And this is very much, this looks very simple and schematic, but it's really in many ways a process where you shift between these categories, and we sometimes start in one place, maybe starting with prototyping an idea, other times you start with fundamental research. So this is really just a model that shows you some of the entry points into the process of innovation that you can take. But what is the job we need labs to do? And in our new book, Design for Policy, we're suggesting some avenues and some things that are important, and I think also signify the kinds of shift that we're seeing happening and we need to make happen. First of all, we need labs to work with government departments to help them not resist complexity, but to embrace it and to invite complexity in, invite the actual experience of people, of organizations into the process of policymaking, recognizing that the world is often unpredictable, the world is often not as simple as we would like it to be, and working with that. And design is offering us ways of engaging in a different kind of dialogue. As Joachim here from the Danish Design School says, design can help us involve stakeholders in a different kind of discussion. So let me just show you something. It's going to look very strange to you, I think. But let me show you how we've engaged with school teachers and policymakers to discuss ways in which we can implement school reform. Let me see, it looks like this. These are ways of using graphic tools and models to have a conversation about the future. These are ways of we use this model. It has different kinds of artifacts, you might call them. These are just symbolic of different functions in a digital system to work with learning objectives for children. And the hands you see in the back are the hands of teachers, and there are also in this workshop policymakers from the Department for Education. And what they're doing here is to have a conversation about what are the functionalities and tools needed in a day-to-day practice as a teacher in a Danish public school to take the ministry's policies of what should the children learn, and working with them in practice in the school and using digital platform devices or a laptop or whatever for that. And so as you can imagine, this is not a digital model or digital solution yet, but it is the beginning of a conversation about what is it even the government wants to achieve and what is the practice that teachers are in. And to prepare this prototype or this model or this design game, we did ethnographic interviewing, observation studies in schools, followed teachers around, saw how they interacted with the children, and looked at what are the tools they have available today and what might be the new functions they would need. And then we simply use this tool as a guide for them. There's a small fork you can see that's a symbolic of how you can grab knowledge from one type of knowledge area, say mathematics, bring it into another knowledge area. There's a straw, we called it the magic straw. It's how can you access online different types of knowledge from evidence-based knowledge about educational models and so forth. So just to say that this is a very, very different way of working with the future, where policymakers and practitioners from the front line can have a conversation. Another thing I would like to highlight is the shift from system focus to citizen centricity, where it's basically a question of understanding how to continuously place citizens' experiences at the heart of the policy process. And how do we see people not as if they're just needs walking around who need to serve, but actually as resources. So let me shift from that quote to Australia, where there's a really wonderful example of how in Adelaide in South Australia, this model called family by family is recognizing that, where the government there has said, well, instead of viewing chaotic families and families with big social problems, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and the risk of child abuse, instead of viewing them as someone where we just look at them from the government and consider should we take the children away or not. But what would happen if we looked at these families as some that actually were striving for a better life? And what they did in this project was to say, well, how do we find and match families that are also in the same socioeconomic situations as those families in crisis, but are doing fine? The positive deviant families who are, in spite of the circumstances, actually have resources, actually have skills, actually have capacities that they can share with those families in crisis. And so this program called Family by Family works to match seeking families that are looking for help with families that can offer assistance through conversations over the kitchen table, having a barbecue together, beginning to learn from what are those families doing. And with this model, for the price and the cost of taking one child away and putting in foster care, you can help 200 families thrive again. And the program has been very thoroughly evaluated by social researchers, and they're saying it's one of the most innovative models they've ever seen in that whole domain of child protection. Another example is how do we shift from unilateral action, thinking that we as a ministry or as an agency or as a city, we must come with the solutions, and realizing that we need to co-produce public value together with others and shape new alliances. Tom Bentley here, who wrote a chapter in our book, he's the former policy advisor to the Australian Prime Minister, and he wrote a new strategy for Australia called Australia in the Asian Century. And one of the tenets of that strategy was to really think about how Australia is in a network situation rather than can act unilaterally. That goes for nations, but it also goes for public institutions. Just to give you a very simple example from Denmark, when the Danish Ministry of Education wanted to unilaterally implement a digital platform for helping unemployed find jobs, we looked at what is actually out there already. And of course, there's not a blank slate. It's not such as if you introduce a new digital platform for unemployed that they have nothing going on already. In fact, this young girl who's an economist or an academic from university, she already has a professional association. She already has a LinkedIn group. She has other things she's using already. So the question becomes, how can this new policy or this new tool work for her in practice together with what's already happening? Or what if you have a mental health problem or health challenge and you're unemployed? Is it really a good idea to do a digital solution? Or maybe you should just spend the money from the agency to work and enhance how the Association for Mental Health Citizens in Denmark can create mentor programs that are much more tangible, physical, and personal meetings and so on. So how do we find ways where we actually work in alliances with stakeholders in society and recognize that no policy will arrive in emptiness? Policies will always arrive, services will always arrive in a world where things are going on. We also talk a lot about facilitation versus stewardship. So to say that what the distinction is that many think that labs are just facilitating conversations between policymakers or policymakers and citizens, but in fact there's such a thing as direction, as intent, as where are we going with this. So in MindLab, for example, when we work on school reform, we listen very carefully to what is the intention of the reform, what are the outcomes we're wanting to achieve. And that's always the question we ask policymakers when we facilitate a workshop. It is not just neutral facilitation, but it is keeping in mind and giving direction and saying, where is it that we are actually going with this, and reminding people why we're here, reminding people what is the change we are hoping to achieve for citizens. And we're lucky in Denmark that the Danish school reform actually has 3 very simple objectives. Children should learn more, especially in Danish and Danish language and mathematics. Children should thrive more and have a better quality of experience in schools. And thirdly, we want to break the social inheritance. We want to create more upward social mobility through our school system, which, by the way, we are failing to do in one of the world's wealthiest countries. We are not we have failed to create upward social mobility in our school system in spite of investing massive amounts in education. So we need to fix that problem. So stewardship has got to do with reminding us why is it that we're here, what is the change we're hoping to achieve. And one example of this from a whole other domain is when we work with businesses and restaurants on the intention of creating a simple one-stop entry point for them. How do you keep that in mind when you have 3 or 4 different agencies that you're working with, and always reminding the agencies it's not about you or you or you, it's about the experiences that this business owner right here in the picture, he's going to have. And how do we co-design or co-create digital solutions, physical solutions, together with the business owner, so we keep that intent in mind. And it's always the test, ultimately, what is he going to experience in terms of a difference because of the policy change and because of the collaboration we have. From policy as strategy to policy as impact. Again, speaking of analysis, it's wonderful to be a policymaker and writing strategy memos and strategy briefs and pushing paper around and writing a lot of beautiful text and 3-point plans and 5-point plans. It's wonderful. It's also very, very easy. But how do we think about impact? How do we think about this change on the ground? How do we put the human experience at the center? So let me tell you a last story from the front lines about putting the human experience at the center. This is a photograph from the borough of Lewisham in London, where some years ago the Design Council in the UK sponsored a project where frontline workers were trained to video film their conversations with clients, with citizens in the homelessness services. How do you think it feels if you're a frontline worker and you're asked to video film your colleagues in their interactions with citizens? Well, it's certainly a question of you can't really escape the truth. What's going on is what's going on. And in this case example, for instance, it turned out that they were asking children of immigrants to be the translators between their parents who did not speak English and the caseworker. So you have children having to have a conversation with their families and the caseworker about the fact that they don't have a place to live. And that's against regulation in the UK, and they were doing it anyway. They hadn't thought about it. It wasn't because they were evil people running the service, they just hadn't thought about it. When you video film, when you capture these concrete interactions, that's when you really see how policies are working in practice, and you can bet that they redesigned this. You can also bet that it wasn't so comfortable in the beginning. This is a quote from the director who ran the service. Change is not necessarily nice or comfortable. Some things we do with citizens is simply dysfunctional. And that's why we also need some courage and some leadership for this to really happen. And that's something we probably have to be more aware of sometimes than we are. This is not just about methods and technocratic tools. This is about something that has to do with emotions and real people in the real world. So we have a current policy model and we have a future design for policy model. And I think, in many ways, this is the shift that we're seeing. We're seeing a shift from resisting to embracing complexity. We're seeing a shift, which I didn't go into detail with today, just because of time, from problem-oriented and reactive policymaking to more proactive and visionary policymaking. This goes for politicians, yes, but it also goes for our civil service, which has a responsibility to be forward-looking and to provide sound, qualified advice and input to the political process. Shifting from a system focus where we're all concerned about our own careers, all concerned about our own internal professions, all concerned about our own organization, to having a citizen focus. And that's a very difficult shift to make. It's one we have to keep working on all the time. Private companies complain that they're not customer focused enough. They even have a hard time doing it, in spite of having the market pressure and the risk of bankruptcy if they don't do it. We in government have an extra very, very heavy obligation to do this because we're not pressured to do it in the same way. But because also it's citizens who pay our salaries, it is citizens who give their trust in us, it's citizens who vote our political masters, it is them we're serving, we are here on behalf of them. I talked about shifting from unilateral action to shaping new alliances, from facilitation to stewardship, and shifting to an impact emphasis, which also has to do with the citizen-centeredness. So at MindLab, we're taking these ideas and these principles and worked with them for quite some time. We've also worked very closely with the Department for Employment in Denmark, which is, they said, in their own saying, they've gone reform crazy. They're implementing 3 or 4 reforms right after one another, parallel to this whole school reform we've got going in another ministry. And this model here is pretty much what they have standing now in their internal texts and documents on how they are doing policymaking. And it might look like a traditional kind of model, but for each of the steps or each of the elements in this model is a set of things they can do, like the ones I've just described, of engaging citizens in practice, engaging stakeholders in practice, from the very first early understanding of the problem, all the way through the intensive phases of political infighting and decision-making, all the way through to implementation. And what I want to highlight here, that I think is just incredibly important when we talk about innovation labs and their roles, it is not only about being in the front end and the early ideas. I showed you also how we're prototyping the educational reform and digital solutions. It is also about that area where you see the circle in the bottom, the unintended consequences. No matter how well we prepare reform, or no matter how well we design it and co-design it with citizens and other stakeholders, it is still going to stand the test of hitting the ground. Right now in Denmark, we are a lot of people who are very interested in seeing how our children will experience education reform. We are very many people who are very interested in seeing whether more people will become employed when we are reforming entitlements and reforming our efforts to help long-term unemployed through all kinds of more proactive, rehabilitating and multidisciplinary employment services. And what we're doing with the ministry is to go out and take a look at that circle there, right there, and saying extremely quickly after a reform is implemented, and look at what difference does it make? Does it matter at all to people? Does it matter to frontline workers who are going to use it? And does it matter to the citizens who are the receiving and experiencing it? So what we've done with the Ministry of Employment is to interview in 5 different cities across Denmark, managers at the front line, people in job centers, professional staff, and first and foremost citizens, and recording citizens' experiences on audio and having their voices and their stories and their narratives and bringing that straight back all the way up to the permanent secretary and to the minister for them to consider what's working and what's not working. Now that is opening policymaking. That is even opening a reform process, which means they can adjust and even change regulation in the reform as it happens. So I think in many ways that this cycle is really one way of looking at how reform and policymaking is an ongoing process of always looking at unintended consequences, both good and bad. Finally, the last 2 minutes, I'll just say what's next for labs to succeed. I think we've already heard some quite very powerful reflections on what will this take. What I'm seeing are some things like this. How do we create an authorizing environment for this kind of work to be legitimate at all levels of government? And that is, again, a leadership issue. It's a political issue as well. What are the skills needed, new competencies, maybe more design, more forward-looking competencies for policymakers at all levels? Recognizing other ways of measuring value. For example, just measuring value by capturing citizen stories. That's what the media and the journalists are doing anyway every single day. Why are we not more professional at working with stories and narratives and cases within bureaucracy? And how much we learn fast and working with the universities and the research community about what are we even doing here. And I think there's a very ripe opportunity in this country right now to connect between our hosts today, also the University of Chile and others who are very keen to follow this as practitioners, as academics, as researchers to help us learn and drive learning, create new partnerships between policy and academia and practice. And of course, the question of what is now the space for political decision-making. I would say this strengthens the space. This makes it more fun and more engaging and more meaningful to be a politician because you actually have a system that will help you achieve your goals rather than a system that will just mindlessly work in its own bureaucratic ways. This is a quote I got from a top executive when I looked at him not too long ago, this summer, and said, listen, we're giving you all this feedback, all this advice, all this learning from the front lines, from citizens, and your people are not listening. Your senior policymakers in your department, your ministry, do not even have the time to go to a workshop on this. And he laughed and he said, are we simply being too busy to get help? And I said, yes. Beware of being too busy to get help. Beware of being too busy to stop and reflect, and beware of being too busy of doing things that are not making any difference to people. We have to create spaces and time and invest time and resources in making this kind of knowledge and these processes relevant. Here are a few resources you can take a look at, including Nesta's very, very good report on innovation teams that I know has been inspired people here. And thanks for listening.
Agradecemos las palabras de Christian Bason. Les queremos recordar que hay más audífonos por si alguien no tiene, para que pase a buscar acá adelante. Y ahora viene la parte de las preguntas. Me imagino que de alta demanda vamos a dar 6 preguntas. Vamos a hacer las preguntas y después va a responder el profesor Bason. Partamos con usted, por favor.
Perdón. Hola, Blanca Velasco. Cristian, cuando ustedes forman a las personas para trabajar cerca de los problemas que tiene la sociedad y que ustedes como gobierno y como MindLab identifican, ¿cuál es el proceso de esa formación y training? Porque como tú bien dijiste hace varios días, has repetido que hay un tema con la forma de interactuar para obtener este compromiso profundo que lleve a romper la barrera de la resistencia al cambio, ¿no? En los funcionarios públicos y también algunas veces en los usuarios finales. Entonces ahí, esta formación ustedes la hacen solamente con funcionarios públicos mezclados con expertos o trainers o gente que trabaja en universidades, no sé. Eso, gracias.
¿Hay al caballero de...? Sí, bueno. Usted, caballero, sí. Micrófono.
¿No? Acá. Mi nombre es Jorge López. Yo trabajo en una institución pública y quiero decir que para los efectos de la vida diaria soy un ciudadano hacia todos los otros servicios. Así que creo que es importante, digamos, tener presente que vivimos la experiencia de todo el mundo y solamente, por decirlo así, desde el punto de vista corporativo, trabajamos en una institución determinada. Quiero contar que el año 2013 la institución donde yo trabajo ganó un premio que daba Corfo en recursos financieros para tener una empresa externa que introdujera en el servicio la innovación. Esta empresa tenía como objetivo precisamente formar un grupo de innovación dentro del servicio, para lo cual se hicieron seminarios, se hizo una lluvia de ideas de innovación, se pesquisaron líderes que pudieran llevar adelante estas ideas de innovación. El proyecto no está terminado, yo creo que por el momento, por razones que no vienen al caso, está detenido, pero una de las principales dificultades que encontramos nosotros es que a los funcionarios del servicio público, y me imagino que esto es generalizado, se trabaja con recursos al límite. Y tú les agregas una nueva función, que además es una función de alta trascendencia, porque es creativa. Hay que pensar, tener tiempo para pensar. Entonces nos encontramos con la dificultad que a este funcionario, como al mago que tiene que hacer girar 10 anillos al mismo tiempo sin que se le caiga ninguno, le estabas entregando una nueva responsabilidad de alta trascendencia. El sistema público chileno tiene limitaciones para contar con más recursos en general del tipo tanto presupuestario como de personas. Este grupo de innovación dentro de nuestra institución, la verdad, o es que sacamos funcionarios de experiencia y los dedicamos, en un grupo pequeño por supuesto, a trabajar la innovación de nuestro servicio y contratamos gente nueva para que haga las tareas de ellos, o permanentemente tenemos que estar asesorados por empresas externas. Yo creo que aquí hay un problema que no sé cómo lo han pensado o cómo podría sugerirse una solución. Gracias.
Gracias. Mi nombre es Jaime Llanes, yo trabajo en un centro de estudio, investigo distintos temas y me interesa también el tema de innovación. me quedó una cita muy grabada del expositor que dice que cuando nosotros queremos apoyar la innovación, tenemos que empezar a nosotros mismos a ir cambiando nuestras prácticas, nuestras formas de organización, nuestras formas de planificación, de ejecución, de medir impacto. Y es interesante, yo quisiera poner una observación aquí hoy día mismo. En el primer bloque hicimos un seminario, como siempre se han hecho los seminarios. Hay un periodo para preguntas, las personas hacen preguntas y los expositores se preocupan de responder cada una de esas preguntas, sean altamente especializados en las preguntas o no, para poder quedar todos en alguna medida ok, me escucharon, me respondieron, etc. La innovación pareciera ser que es que nosotros mismos empecemos a cambiar nuestras prácticas. Y yo esperaba vivir un seminario. Por ahí, cuando venía temprano subiendo las escaleras, le dije a alguien que venía también acá, le dije, ojalá sea un seminario altamente innovativo, distinto. Y fíjense que lo primero que yo esperaba aquí con esto, que a lo mejor todos los que estamos aquí pudiéramos, si teníamos el espacio que nos dieran la palabra, de relatar quizás nuestras experiencias, quizás nuestras dificultades, quizás nuestras necesidades, quizás nuestros deseos, nuestras expectativas, porque así todos los que organizan, los expertos, podrían haber escuchado, llevado tanta experiencia, tantos relatos de la vida humana, que nos pueden estar diciendo, estamos en pro de la innovación, estamos haciendo resistencia a la innovación, etc. Y finalmente yo quisiera decirle que en el aparato público, en todos los sistemas públicos, el gran tema de todas estas cosas es lo que se llamaría la gestión del cambio. Porque todo esto ocurre con las personas. Pero ¿qué pasa? Por una primera idea que yo tiro en el debate acá. ¿Cómo se reclutan hoy día los recursos humanos en el aparato público? Fíjense que yo creo que si nosotros fuéramos al ciudadano, un porcentaje importante de la ciudadanía no estaría de acuerdo con la forma que reclutamos, seleccionamos, asignamos y en alguna medida hacemos una inducción de los recursos humanos en todos los gobiernos, sea uno de un lado o de otro lado. Y parece que ahí hay algo que anda mal. Hay muchas cosas que andan mal, pero también hay muchas cosas que andan bien. Lo más interesante de lo que anda bien, y yo felicito a todos los que estamos aquí y a los organizadores, que estamos interesados de que las cosas no sigan igual, aun cuando sabemos que para que las cosas cambien vamos a tener que tener mucha paciencia, mucho esfuerzo, mucho sacrificio y mucho talante para seguir adelante. Gracias.
Quiero reiterar que por favor las preguntas las hagamos bien precisas. Sabemos que todos quieren participar, hablar, pero el tiempo es escaso. Acá adelante, no sé, ¿alguien quería...? ¿Atrás tú? Sí. No, tú el que estás de chaleco.
Hola, mi nombre es Gonzalo León. Cristian, nos has contado la experiencia de Dinamarca, porque sabemos que hay labs en otros países que están funcionando, algunos se han cerrado, pero tenemos una diversidad territorial, al menos en Chile, que es importante. Tenemos casi 10 o 20 veces el territorio que tiene Dinamarca. Tenemos 365 municipios con una diversidad territorial importante. No lo hemos escuchado de ti, tampoco lo escuchamos en el bloque anterior. ¿Qué recomendaciones puedes hacer en este momento de diseño del lab que se está haciendo en Chile para hacerse cargo de la diversidad territorial? Principalmente porque en tu ponencia planteaste que se enfoca mucho en lo que es la observación, en experimentar cómo se vivencia el servicio. Pero en la diversidad chilena tenemos distintas experiencias donde hay municipios que tienen altísimos niveles de profesionalización versus municipios que casi no cuentan con profesionales. Entonces, si nos puedes ayudar con algunas pautas en cómo implementarlo, haciéndose cargo de esta diversidad. Gracias.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es José Miguel Varas, trabajo en un hospital público de alta complejidad y mi pregunta, señor Cristian, más que nada radica en cómo nos puede describir someramente, obviamente, cómo este tema de los labs, los laboratorios, ¿cierto?, impactan dentro de la salud pública. ¿Por qué lo digo? Bien cortito. Porque hay muchas iniciativas en este país, sobre todo comandadas también por el Ministerio, por otros ministerios también, sobre todo con el desafío Chile Gestiona, que han podido implementarse bastante en nuestro sector. O, por ejemplo, otros desafíos que me comentaban, por ejemplo, que van a hacer un proyecto a nivel regional, acá en la región metropolitana, creo, con el tema de las consultas en la APS. de que el usuario pueda pedir a través de su smartphone, ¿cierto?, la consulta. Pero eso, ¿qué nos provoca? Que al final las consultas médicas, a pesar de los especialistas que siguen faltando, y entre otras cosas, al final después se deriven al sistema más grande, que es el sector terciario salud, y por ende se siga atochando el sistema y se tenga que hacer otras medidas. Entonces, a veces, en nuestro sector de salud, a veces sentimos de que la innovación, nosotros mismos, dentro del mismo sector, podemos ir, por decirlo, apoyando o creando cosas, ¿cierto? Pero obviamente el sector que se comentó en las ponencias anteriores, el sector directivo no recoge esas iniciativas, o las recoge pero no son implementadas. Entonces, más que nada, nos gustaría saber, uno, esta reflexión, y dos, cómo es esta parte de los labs en el sistema de salud danés del que usted representa. Muchas gracias.
Cristian, una pregunta relacionada con cómo gestionar la tasa de fallas. Y tú algo lo mencionaste, el tema de las fallas en el mundo público aparecen en la prensa, digamos. Entonces, ¿cómo han trabajado en MindLab? ¿Cuál es la tasa de falla que tienen primero respecto de estos procesos de innovación? ¿Y cómo gestionan esas fallas? Y lo otro que uno echa de menos también, y ahí va la pregunta, ¿cómo han trabajado como los órganos de control? En Chile, y uno echa de menos, aquí no he visto quién de órganos de control, cómo han trabajado con los órganos de control, que habitualmente son tanto refractarios a la innovación. Gracias.
Gracias por la pregunta, señor profesor Bison.
So thanks for quite long and detailed questions. I'll try to provide some long and detailed answers. On the question of training, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a question of a simple fix that build innovation labs and then everything is done. I think it's extremely critical, as was also mentioned by the other gentleman, to think about the human resource side of this. What are the skills, the capabilities, the abilities we need in the public service of the future? It may not be totally the same as in the past. Let me give you an example of how I think it could be powerful to work with training. Right now, I'm conducting executive training for the city of Copenhagen for their level 2, next to the top leaders and managers across all divisions of the city, even from the fire department to health to sports and to the central administration. And what the city has done there is to organize people in small teams of 3 or 4 people from each division, from different offices, and then give them challenges. And so not only are they giving theories and approaches and methods for innovation, they're also giving concrete challenges to solve on behalf of their senior executive managers, which they then work on, and where we actually help them in action learning about how to address it. And so combining theory and practice in a very, very concrete way that matters to their own organization, I think, is one way forward. And that training model, if you do not have it already, is something I think is worth pursuing. Then there was the point from over here. There were several points, I think. One is to say that if you're a public servant or work in government, you're also a citizen. So why do we need to spend all this energy and time on engaging citizens when we can just look at how we experience as people, as citizens, services? Let me give you an example from the UK, where we interviewed a civil servant in a British tax authority. And he was sitting in his office in London, and he looked at us and he said, when I think about citizens, I think about a white man aged in mid-40s, educated at Oxford, with a higher education, and living in London. The biggest problem he had in his policymaking was how to get Somali women and immigrant women who do not speak English, have no education, to pay their taxes. We are, of course, citizens, but we are not necessarily the citizens we serve. And we need continuously to remind ourselves of putting ourselves in other people's shoes. I call it, other people too, I guess, call it professional empathy. And we need to make that a priority. It was also mentioned that, and with a little bit, I think, maybe of frustration, that that having external consultancies come in and teach us about innovation may not really work always. And while there is a role, I think, for external consulting, I was a management consultant myself for 10 years before becoming a civil servant. And just those of you who are not realizing this, MindLab is a part of the public sector. I'm a civil servant myself. I would say that what we're seeing is that critical functions of government are being insourced. Okay, so something as critical as innovation is not something you give to consultants only. It's something you do yourself, and you make it a priority organizationally, in terms of capacity, in terms of leadership. An example in the digital domain is that the British government has insourced a lot of its digital work on e-government in the Cabinet Office in something called Government Digital Services. The first year where they insourced and designed a new approach to digital citizen-centered services, they saved about 50 million pounds in half a year by stopping contract with big IT service providers and doing it themselves. Because of course, in a situation where citizens engage with government digitally, that is a key critical function of government and not something you can just give to others. It's something you also have to have embedded internally yourself. Yes, then this question about how these conferences are organized. I love the question because, this is actually not so bad, but I've been at conferences that are absolutely terrible in terms of the conversations and the level of innovation. And I recognize that these forums where we are 150 people, or how many we are not necessarily where you can really get into detail about your experiences and the frustrations and the problems and the challenges. But that is in fact the way innovation labs try to work. They do not work in ways like this where we just have this kind of dialogue. They work where we actually get up and standing and work with each other and look at ideas together and challenge each other and engage multiple different stakeholders in a very honest conversation with that stewardship and that intent that I talked about earlier. So it's not just anything goes, but it's actually with direction to solve problems together. And I do agree again this point about the whole recruitment side and who is it that we are having in government. And I do very much agree on the capacity to manage change. Change management or change leadership is part of this agenda of innovation. It is part of what it needs to take an idea into practice and into implementation. But first we have to find out what is it we're going to change. Right, so the process of innovation is not just changing stuff, it's understanding the nature of the problems, understanding which ideas might be useful, testing them out, and then beginning to lead that change process. So I think it's a subsidiary process. The territorial issue, yes, you may think that Chile is larger than Denmark, but actually that's not true. Because Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom. And Greenland's territory, I think, is bigger than Chile's. There's only about 50,000 people there. But those 50,000 people have managed, with the help of Denmark, to have some of the worst social problems in education, in crime, in violence, in alcohol addiction, anywhere in our country. So I'm aware of the territorial point, not saying that Greenland is always enough on our radar in Denmark, but I would say, yes, of course, you're totally right. We have to take a regional and local perspective on this. I would say that in many ways, what you probably will see 10 years from now is an ecosystem of labs across different levels of government, also academic institutions and others building innovation labs that can be useful in their work. We're seeing a massive shift in city-level government administrations. The city we work with, Odense, part of my board, but it also has its own local innovation team. We see cities like Boston and New York City and others establishing innovation teams. Bloomberg Philanthropies organized something called City Lab last Monday, Tuesday, this week in Los Angeles, where 400 people were discussing innovation in cities as the place where things, policies actually hit the ground, and where maybe cities are the most relevant levels to really have this kind of work. I would insist that government policy probably makes a difference too, but we should have regional and city investment and capabilities for this too. Yes, let's see if I've got the last ones here. Healthcare. Thanks for I think there was a question there too. I think one of the key points in healthcare that we have to remember is that the entire model of healthcare systems in most countries is broken. We are investing 95 to 99% of our efforts in healthcare at fixing people who are sick, instead of spending energy and money and time and investment on avoiding them to get sick in the first place. Prevention is by no means prioritized heavily enough, whether it's in UK, in Denmark, or probably, I'm just guessing, in Chile. And so that's one place to start. Another place to start is that you may have a model like we have in Denmark, where we pay hospitals for how active they are. So we're paying by activity, which means that hospitals actually have an incentive to have a lot of patients and get them back again. We do not pay hospitals in my country to make people healthy. I wonder if you have an outcome-based financing model where you actually fund hospitals based on how healthy people get and whether they stay away from hospitals because they don't have to go there. I would say that the human-centered design approaches I've been mentioning is something we have worked with quite some effect at the Danish National Hospital in Copenhagen, the Mayo Clinic and Kaiser Permanente, which are very well-run American hospitals, have for quite a few years embraced human-centered design and innovation processes within their organizations. And so I think there's a huge potential for hospitals to work on finding out something that sounds counterintuitive, which is a hospital that is human-centric and not doctor-centric or nurse-centric. And I realize the point being made, sir, about new technologies driving up cost and driving up demand and putting new pressures on the system. And of course, that's the innovation challenge, isn't it? To find digital solutions and other processes that can drive down the cost. But just to give an example, when we worked at the Danish National Hospital and said, what would it take to place patients at the center of our services, they found ways to cut in half the time that heart patients would have to be at the hospital. 50% reduction. It took them about 30 minutes in a workshop to discover that. Finally, the excellent question on managing failure. There's this sentence that American companies like the consultancy IDEO likes to use, and it sounds a little cheesy, but actually it has some merit to it, which is to fail early to succeed sooner. Which means that the more we test and experiment in a small scale with actual users early on, that we can eliminate failure, eliminate mistakes, and we can be more confident that we can have success with our policies or services. And I would say at Denmark, at MindLab, we fail too. I would say that 1 in 10 projects never get off the ground. We also have the ability to shut down a project where we don't believe we can make a difference. And we did that twice this spring, and I'm very proud of that. That is not why I'm leaving MindLab, but I'll shift jobs in about a month. But it was a pleasure, I can tell you, to retract our efforts because we could see we couldn't make a difference with the managers that we had to work with. On control and compliance, some of the most innovative agencies in the world are exactly the taxation offices and some of the compliance offices. I understand also in this country that you actually have a quite modern taxation approach and system. I think there's very interesting things you can do there. I mentioned a case example on occupational safety and food safety as well. So we have experience working with compliance agencies, and I think there's a really, really big opportunity, especially at finding the right balance between compliance and service and helping them look at what outcomes they're generating. For example, a taxation office does not exist to find people who are cheating in the system and catch them. A taxation system exists to make sure we're getting the revenues from taxes we would like to get. Okay, I think that was pretty much it. I really apologize if there's someone I didn't catch in terms of the questions, but there were quite a few. I hope this was useful, and would be happy to have a conversation over lunch with those of you who are still burning to air your questions or your frustrations. I think what you've been sharing with us, with me now, is significant because I can feel that some people are experiencing this as maybe this is for real. And you know, if this is for real, what we're talking about today and what the government intends to do, then it will both be frustrating, challenging, painful, but it will also be extremely enriching and beneficial to this country. So good luck.
Agradecemos la exposición y la respuesta efectuadas por Christian Bason del MindLab. Bueno, acá Mario me recuerda que a contar del lunes las presentaciones las podrán encontrar en nuestro sitio web www.sistemaspúblicos.cl para que las puedan bajar y ahí profundizar si algo se les pasó. Bueno, ahora nos corresponde escuchar la exposición de nuestro segundo invitado internacional, señor Kevin de Souza, quien se desempeña como profesor de la Escuela de Asuntos Públicos de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona y que se referirá al emprendimiento al interior de las organizaciones. Tendrá un tiempo de 35 minutos.
Okay, so it is a pleasure to be here, and I would like to open up by saying my appreciation for Mario and his group, and also our host. I have enjoyed hearing all of the discussion that's happened this morning, and as the conversation was evolving, I completely revised my presentation, and so we are going to have slides, but I have a new presentation over here because I think we need to learn how to co-create. So let me begin by highlighting a few of the big words that I heard. I heard the thing about change a lot of times. I heard the thing about innovation, about culture, about the role of experts from the outside. I heard about the pressures of not to fail, especially when you use public money. And so if you take all of these issues at a high level, what I would like to convey in the next few minutes is a few strategies where these issues can actually be addressed through very simple alterations in how we do work and how do we process information in our agencies, in our organizations. So let me begin by showing you an example. So this image on the screen is an image of a railway, and you'll see a girl, she's probably 8 or 9, trying to get water to her home, right? So I like this image a lot. This was used in one of my articles on fragile environments and how do we need to build innovation. So if you look at this image carefully, you'll realize that the problem is not that we don't know how to produce water. The problem is not we don't know how to transport water. The problem is not that we don't have railways or roads. These are not the problems, right? The problem is we have institutions that haven't been able to adapt and change to be able to solve a very practical problem. This is not a problem of innovation, but innovation is needed in order for us to take existing things we know and actually apply it to this problem. Let me show you another image. This is a similar problem. Again, it's about water, but now in this image you see the more profound issue about how the environment around the water problem is making an already critical issue even more challenging. If you see the image carefully, there's a lot of pollution happening, that water is being used to drink, but it's also being used to actually take a bath in. And that water, if you see the image from its real context, it's actually wastewater out of an industry that's making money right next to this, right? And so if you look at this problem again, we need entrepreneurship. We need new ways to solve this problem, right? And again, I would like to highlight, we know how to deal with this from an engineering point of view. We know how to deal with this from a design point of view. This is a social problem. Now, a critical reason why I was excited to be here this afternoon is, I think, the institute that is being created and the programs underway as part of the Center for Public Innovation at the University of Chile has the ability to examine problems that have these complex features in them. They have the ability to take problems like this, right, that have engineering components, that have policy problems, that have public administration components, that have economics components, and solve them in an integrated manner. Right? There are very few institutions around the world that have the composition of the expertise that this group is now bringing together. So I have great hope. Now, the reason why we need entrepreneurship is related to the question that was asked earlier by the gentleman on my right about the need for slack in our institutions. Do we have to add another job? Do we have to create another role? Do we have to add these things to an already stressed environment in order to innovate? I think not, and I will explain why hopefully soon. But before, let me show you the range of things that make innovation very hard, right? So you have missions. Different organizations, different agencies have different goals. These have been established through history. They are very hard to change and very hard to redesign. The way agencies operate is through projects. And if any of you know, projects are highly, highly complex as well. They have multiple interweaving elements that make them really hard. Then you have technology. Okay, here I will just frame a critical hypothesis. As we have advanced and developed more innovative technology, unfortunately, we have also failed largely when we try to implement them. You can just look at major programs at many institutions that have tried to adopt large-scale information technologies. You also have citizens, and they have ever-changing needs and desires, plus they have been stressed, and they continue to be stressed given the economic realities, which makes the job of institutions challenging. You then have processes, and large bureaucracies have lots of processes. Changing them is also hard. Institutions, ideas, right? And if I click through, you then have this dual thing about are we employees, but are we also representatives of who are we trying to solve? And then we have networks. Networks basically point to the fact that no one agency or institution can actually solve a problem. You have to collaborate across agencies. So if you take any one of these and you try to address them, you will soon realize that these things are very, very interdependent. So just as an example, if you take the three at the end, employees, networks, and institutions, trying to solve them is not easy. If you take employees, processes, and projects and try to solve that problem, it's not easy. And what I find is in most large agencies, individuals are aware of the interdependent nature of these issues. This, however, results in a simple but yet highly critical problem. We freeze when it comes to innovation. We say that we can't do anything. It's very hard, it's extremely difficult, right? The real joy, though, of innovation is to recognize that even given these complexities, there is a way to make some forward progress. Now, it might not be gigantic progress, but there is a way to build processes. And so, one of the process that my research group created quite a few years back was was how to help organizations move ideas very, very quickly. So at the heart of innovation is ideas. Ideas are plentiful in most organizations. The challenge is not generating new ideas. Most of the time, the challenge is how do we go about executing on this large collection of ideas? So we began this project quite a few years back, trying to understand how do large organizations innovate, right? So if you look at just the IT world, the information technology world, at one point, right, you had a company called IBM that everybody thought was the greatest innovative IT company around. Then you had this little guy called Gates, Bill Gates, that came along and created a small thing called Microsoft. Then everybody thought Microsoft is very good. And people were continuing. And then two guys who were bored created Google. And then people thought, oh no, Google's the best. Until one guy created what? Facebook. Now people think Facebook's the best, right? But what you realize, if you look at these cases, right? These were always large organizations that were grown out of small ideas. But the minute they became large, they lost some of their edge to innovate. And so they were replaced, and next one, and next one, and next one. One of the really nice things about public institutions is they don't get replaced that easily. Public institutions have the ability to withstand large time frames. They have the ability to see longer down the horizon. They have the ability to change slowly, but yet very, very profoundly. And so what I would like to show you is how do you work through this process of moving ideas within these agencies? How do you do it in a highly effective manner? And I would like to call your attention to a point that was again raised early on about employees having ideas, but then they have to be routed to a manager, and then the manager has to do it, or there's this friction between employees and managers. In this graph, I call it employees and organization. So organization represents the management, and employees are the front line. And yes, there is this friction, right? And in my book, I address through each of these phases, how do you reduce that friction? Because it is that very friction between employees and organization, or employees and managers, where a lot of the innovation energy gets wasted. Okay? So let me go through this process really quickly. So in the first stage of idea generation and mobilization, this is where you look at how do you actually bring new thoughts, new insights to a problem. And there are three key things. I mean, for any one of these, I could have highlighted 20 things, but I'm just going to choose 3 or so for each one. One is this issue of environments of need and environments of play. As Christian noted in his graphs, there were a few examples of playfulness. Playfulness in how you've come up with ideas. But as noted in a few of the remarks, there was the issue of need, because you have to solve current problems, you have to do certain things, right? This is where, in order to be highly successful at innovation, you need both. You can't just be in the business of solving problems, but you can't just be in the business of playing. You need to find ways to marry the two. And this is where this institute and the research ability of a large institution like the University of Chile comes in, because they can play a bit. They can play on ideas that you can't play in your regular day-to-day organizations. They can also learn from you and bring those need-based problems into the lab. trying to innovate with one without the other will never work, because then you'll just be solving problems and you'll be known as the ones who are just responsible for problems. You don't want to have that brand name. Incentives are huge, and this is where most agencies, right, especially in the public sector, most individuals that join a public job care more about things beyond their own bank account, right? I mean, if we wanted to be rich, we could do a lot of other things, right? But incentives are really, really important. How do you design incentives? How do you create awards? How do you recognize good ideas that are not just good because they have been written on an article or a 3-point list, but good ideas because they have the potential to open up new lines of inquiry, okay? Networks are huge. Here, I will give you a simple thing to try. If you ask any of your employees to just list the top 20 people they know outside their organization, just make a list. You will be amazed how many doors that can open for your business, for your agency, for your institution. We have no ways to encourage employees to bring their networks, and they have very deep networks, into the organization, right? Your employees are your best sources of credibility assessment for these networks. And if you triangulate that information, if you leverage it, you will have a much faster rate of mobilizing ideas from the outside in, which is huge. And most agencies still have a long way to go in allowing employees to bring their ideas and their networks into the organization. In the next phase, this is idea advocacy and screening. So please excuse my highly skeptical view on innovation. Whenever we propose a new idea, right, the first reaction of everybody is to criticize it and to screen it. We react that way. And unfortunately, in our institutions, we have built processes to reinforce that, right? So the same approaches we use to screen whether we should buy a chair or a mic, which are very structured decisions, we try to apply that same level of scrutiny, same level of rigor to an idea that has not even developed yet, right? Imagine, so I was trying to think of an analogy on my flight, and I had some extended time to do that for reasons, but it's the analogy of trying to evaluate an unborn baby, right? And try to predict what are they going to do at age 21. It's quite challenging, right? So when it comes to innovation, we need to be a little less critical, little less screening and risk focused, and a little more advocacy focused. Now this is where, again, I will use the analogy of the kid, right? So think about young kids, and I don't have any, but I see this often, right? When you see a mother or a father, they only highlight what's good about the kid, right? Oh, he's the best, he's very nice, right? And everybody else, when they see the baby, oh, it's so cute and so nice, nobody's going to go and say, normally, right? That, oh, your baby needs more hair, or what's wrong with the eyes? No. We advocate, we champion, right? Our first reaction is to wish them well. We champion. And so in large organizations, and especially ones that care about innovation, it's very important to formalize a process for advocacy early on. For every screening process you have, you need to have one for advocacy, one for championing, right? This is very important. And the last one in this thing is have a portfolio of ideas, right? Not all ideas are going to transform the future. You need the little ideas because those small wins help you garner the organizational backing and trust and credibility. So you need a portfolio approach. Third one is experimentation, and this has come up quite frequently in the discussion, this issue about failure. And here I agree wholeheartedly with my colleague who noted that in order to succeed, you need to fail often, right? The slight twist that I'll make on it is if you run experiments, right? There's actually nothing like a failed experiment. There's just results that didn't play out as your hypothesis was, right? You thought X plus Y is equal to Z, and when you collected data, it said X plus Y is equal to Z prime. Okay, that's not a failure. There is an opportunity for you to revise your theory, revise your approach, revise your thinking, and maybe try something better the next time. So in large organizations, I spend a lot of time helping them build a culture of experimentation, right? Where it's not about, can I propose a project that I know 100% is going to be exactly like I proposed it? Because I will tell you, there's no such project, right? The minute you propose a project, the environment has changed, that something is not going to play out as you decide. That is okay. That is the joy of experimenting. And a lot of leading companies and leading institutions that are very good at innovation actually have fairly detailed experimentation processes. This is where I think there's an opportunity for academia, industry, government to all collaborate on how do we build these experimentation processes across institutions to reduce some of these barriers to collaboration. The word frugal is there because experimentation doesn't have to be expensive, right? So here again, let me relate this to the issue of the networks. To try out new ideas today, and especially in the public sector, there are forums, there are crowdsourcing platforms, there are ways for you to collect evidence on an idea very cheaply. Very cheaply, you can test multiple hypotheses. So you don't need a large budget even to experiment. But you have to take the risk to share an idea that's not fully developed. This is where the co-creation comes in. You have to bring your communities into that experiment and make sure they have a chance to contribute to the design of those experiments. And a lot of agencies around the world are building frugal experimentation processes to fail often, right? Learning is important. Every experiment opens up new opportunities to learn. One of the things in established institutions is the struggle to learn, right? And the reason being, and I wrote about this quite a few years back, I call it the destruction capability. And quite briefly, it just means the following. We try to keep adding to our knowledge. You know, we have archives and archives of memos and processes and histories. We never actually delete stuff, right? So think about your own behavior as you use information technology. We love to aggregate. And as hardware has become cheaper, we add more. When was the last time you actually deleted stuff? Think about that, right? Most organizations have never said, let's hit the delete button. So there's no room. So thinking through experimentation, you have to learn to remove old stuff. Commercialization is very important. The private sector knows this extremely well. But this is also important in the public environment. And it's important for two reasons. One, every new policy has a price. There is a price to adopt a new policy. There's an opportunity cost associated with a new policy. There is an adoption cost. There's an implementation cost. So as we design new policies, new instruments, we have to think about issues of pricing. We have to think about issues of placement, just like the private enterprise thinks about how to design the package. If we want things adopted in the public environment, we have to think about placement. And we have to reward early adopters. So a lot of the work that the labs are doing across the world is they are working with lead users. And they're rewarding them by helping them get access to ideas that are just at the edge of a lab or even in the lab, right? So how do you create rewards for your customers, your residents, your communities? It becomes important. Once an idea is out there, right, we seldom spend a lot of time doing evaluation of that idea from the point of view of learning how to build the next thing. We do a lot of evaluation to assign blame in the public environment. We do a lot of evaluation to justify cost and justify the investment, but we seldom do evaluation to learn in order to design the next policy, the next innovation, the next challenge. Here, I think, again, because we live in a world where everybody is connected, right? We live in the world where we play these dual roles. We are both employees, we are managers, we are citizens, right? We are leaders and we are followers. We have the ability to actually spend some time looking at policies, looking at ideas, looking at innovation, and saying, okay, how did this help us design the next generation, rather than complete reboot all the time, okay? So, early in the morning, we heard about this issue of how do we take these ideas and implement them locally, right? So there's this issue of scaling. We also heard the question about heterogeneity of Chile and the scale of Chile from a geographic distance point of view. Here are a couple of kind of things to consider as you build your innovation processes. One is you always begin locally, right? You don't try to solve things globally before you solve them locally. So if you have multiple communities, begin with a few of them that are very different, and then see how things work and then regionalize. I've already highlighted the need for advocacy and experimentation. Process mapping becomes very important here, right? The process one community takes to innovate, or one group of organizations, or one lab, we have to take the time to document it, we have to take the time to benchmark it, we have to take the time to evaluate. And then the maturity will come through experience. And this is where you have to give people time to learn, time to try things out, and not view everything as a failure, because capabilities are not going to be built if you don't allow individuals some slack to experiment. And so very mature capabilities is going to require time. Lastly, one of the things I will wrap up with here is the issue of how to deal with these four big things that I see in the public environment. One is inertia. Two is visualizing. Three is front lines, and fourth is incentives. So let me give you an example. I would hypothesize that in Chile, like in most other countries, that you hear a lot about the failure of the public environment. You hear a lot about the failure of institutes and investments, and those make front page news, right? I think all of you in this room have a responsibility to add to the narrative with your successes, right? So in the US, I had the pleasure of evaluating a project for the US Census Bureau, where unlike most IT projects that are over budget, beyond time, so on and so forth, they came under budget, okay? The last time the US Census Bureau did a count of the US was in 2000. Then they did it in 2010, okay? For those of you, just take a moment to think about how complicated the world has gotten from 2000 to 2010. Take a moment to think about how our environments have changed. Take a moment to think about how demographics have changed, so on and so forth. Highly complex. But they came in under budget and on time and super results. And this public official was giving a talk and everybody was wowed. I went to him and I said, can I write about it? So I wrote about it. And the minute I wrote about it, now everybody knows about that case, right? We don't take the time to actually document and visualize when we make a difference in innovation. I think as we invest into institutes, into our processes, we need to do that, because otherwise you don't visualize these things. It's happening. All of you are innovating, but you are highly skeptical of your own innovation. So before you criticize your own innovation, write it up. Let other people criticize it, right? And the last thing, incentives. I think one of the beauties about forums like this is, and especially to see the crowded room, you all want to innovate, so you don't need this incentives a lot, right? Otherwise, you all could have done many other things with your time this afternoon. So with that, I will take the questions, but I also want to thank the organizers for having me. Thank you.
Agradecemos la exposición del profesor Kevin de Souza. Les quiero comentar que aparte de la gente que estamos reunidos acá, en vía streaming nos están siguiendo 200 personas, así que ha sido un acto realmente masivo y que nos ha motivado bastante. Ahora viene la parte de las preguntas. Al profesor de Souza van a hacer 6 preguntas y después viene la respuesta y después ya cortamos la primera mitad de este seminario. Parte allá, por favor.
Hola, soy Delfina de la Red de Innovación Local de Argentina. Primero contarles que de Argentina vemos a Chile como un ejemplo en las políticas de innovación y emprendimiento, así que por eso venimos a aprender de ustedes. Sabemos que nos llevan mucha ventaja. Y nosotros trabajamos en la Argentina, tenemos el 80% de las ciudades con menos de 10.000 habitantes. Y creo que de la teoría estamos todos muy de acuerdo y no sé, hablamos del beneficio, la potencialidad de co-crear, de validar con los beneficiarios reales, pero lo que nos pasa es que lo que parecería ser el mejor terreno para aplicar toda esta teoría, que son los gobiernos locales más chicos, que tienen ese contacto directo, conocen los problemas y sería más fácil, no tenemos absolutamente ningún ejemplo de implementación de todo esto. De hecho, nosotros ahora estamos empezando a fomentar los equipos de innovación en estas ciudades, pero hasta hace 6 meses estábamos trabajando absolutamente solo con teoría y sin ningún ejemplo de ciudades de esta escala. De hecho, el informe que mencionan de eTeams son 2 de ciudades súper grandes. Y por otro lado, es como que la teoría nos plantea otro escenario aplicable a ciudades chicas y vemos que no lo están haciendo.
¿Más preguntas? ¿Quién quiere? Levante la mano, por favor, para que... Pablo, si puede ir, por favor.
Primero que nada, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Jorge Barriga y soy estudiante de la universidad. Y quería hacer una reflexión. No puedo estar más en acuerdo con lo que dice Kevin Souza. El problema no son las ideas, sino que son la implementación. Creo que el Estado, en el gran déficit que ha tenido el tema sobre la implementación. Nadie puede negar que Transantiago en su esencia es una muy buena idea, pero el problema sin duda fue la implementación. Ahora, con respecto a los MindLab, me hago la pregunta, a lo mejor, ¿no será que estamos poniendo los huevos, los bueyes antes de, la carreta antes de los bueyes? En el sentido de que, primero que yo nunca he tenido claro cuál es la estrategia de Chile con respecto hacia dónde vamos, cuál es la visión de país que nosotros tenemos. Porque lo veo en el mundo privado, se llenan de las empresas de áreas de I+D, pero no hay una visión estratégica de decir para dónde vamos. Y simplemente es seguir modas y que en el fondo no se sabe para dónde va. Esas son las dos reflexiones.
Acá, sí. Gracias. Mi nombre es Ariel Vázquez Elorza, soy de México, de la Universidad Autónoma de San Luis Potosí, egresado del Magíster. Quisiera preguntar, parecido a la pregunta de Argentina, México es un país federal. Generalmente las políticas de la federación se toman a nivel nacional en todas las secretarías de Estado. Sin embargo, a veces a los gobiernos locales y municipales no baja. Me gustaría saber qué propondrían o cómo se podría realizar estas políticas públicas para que se desarrollaran desde lo local. Y no solamente desde el punto de vista gubernamental, es decir, que el gobierno lo fomente, sino que la ciudadanía se empodere de ello, o sea, que sea la misma ciudadanía que pueda desarrollarlo. ¿Hay algún modelo en específico o experiencia? Gracias.
Mi nombre es Tyndall y quisiera saber cómo incentivamos a los trabajadores en el sector público, sobre todo, a que cuando tienen nuevas ideas las propongan, pero cuando esas ideas chocan con, por ejemplo, en el sector público, muchas veces chocan con el presupuesto. ¿Cómo hacemos para que esos trabajadores se sigan manteniendo innovados o cómo hacemos para que esas ideas puedan surgir de alguna otra forma y el trabajador no se sienta frustrado porque siente que no lo están escuchando, porque no es escuchado por el jefe? Muchas veces pasa que los trabajadores, y creo que en el sector público, en cualquier trabajo, tenemos muchas ideas acerca de lo que podría ser y se la proponemos al jefe de arriba y el jefe de arriba tiene una visión distinta de lo que debería ser, no está de acuerdo con la estrategia, no hay presupuesto. Esa idea de repente es difícil de hacer. No quiere decir que el jefe piense que es malo, pero ¿cómo manejamos esa situación? ¿Cómo somos transparentes? ¿Cómo le manifestamos al trabajador que sí la idea es buena, pero que no podemos hacerla? O que si es mala, ¿cómo le decimos en realidad no se puede? Eso, gracias.
Solo dos preguntas más, no sé quién...
Me parecieron muy interesantes las dos exposiciones y me da para pensar, y lo que voy a hablar es un pensamiento que me surge al escucharlo. Yo creo que este asunto del laboratorio, en el que debieran participar no solo el gobierno, sino que actores ciudadanos, el sector privado, la academia, para resolver problemas concretos, debiera existir, debiera ser un modelo funcional que exista no solo a nivel del Estado, como se planteó aquí en un comienzo, entre Hacienda, la SUDERE y qué sé yo, sino que más bien a nivel de cada organismo existir esta instancia que es una instancia que permite el fluir de las ideas, el fluir de la innovación. Entonces, más bien no hablar de un laboratorio, sino que hablar de una forma de funcionar. No sé si me explico eso. Gracias.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Kenia Arenas y quiero hacer una consulta bien concreta. Me gustaría preguntar qué se puede hacer a partir de tu experiencia para que los innovadores, la gente que somos felices innovando y que nos planteamos frente al mundo con nuevas ideas y estamos siempre tratando de mejorar procesos, siendo eficientes, ¿cómo podemos ir generando tal vez un espacio más protegido para que nosotros podamos ir haciendo estas innovaciones, poniéndolas en práctica? Me ha tocado mucho trabajar en el sector público y desde que comencé a trabajar hace más de 20 años, siempre uno se enfrenta ante una institución que tal vez es un poquito dura y que no está preparada para los cambios. Entonces, este concepto que es tan bonito de pensar el futuro, las nuevas generaciones, cómo lo hacemos para efectivamente ir subiéndonos a los cambios, que son maravillosos, ¿cómo lo podemos hacer para generar este espacio, este lab tal vez, y tal vez muchos labs, pero en forma más protegida? ¿Cuál es el mecanismo o el instrumento que se puede aplicar?
So I appreciate all the questions, and I'm going to try to go in the order that I received them. So let me begin with a highly interesting question from Argentina. This seems like the United Nations, because we have Argentina, Mexico, you know. So I will begin with Argentina. There are examples of innovation that's happening in local communities. I agree with you that those are not as highly profiled as the innovations that are happening at the major metropolitan regions of the world. But there is a lot of work that's happening around community-based innovation. This is happening, as you noted, in Argentina. It's happening in small communities, but it's also happening in Mexico. It's happening in India. It's happening in South Africa. And actually, one of the images that I had presented early on is actually from an article that I wrote that looked at how do you innovate in highly fragile environments with no resources, right? And this is where you have to leverage the local knowledge of the community. Just as an example, the fridge that you and I have in our house, right? It's a highly complex device. There's a different temperature to keep the wine. There's different temperature to keep the vegetables. There's a freezer that's different, right? Well, if you try to build a cheaper fridge that has all those features, it's very hard. But in a community, they were able to build a fridge with 10% of the components of the fridge you and I have that just keeps food cold. That's innovation that made a difference in that community. Right? Because before, they had no way to store food from day to day. And that had huge implications for the life of that community. But through leveraging the local indigenous knowledge, we have the ability to actually shape how we innovate. And we need to find more ways to get that story out. The other question I got was about implementation, and let me actually connect that idea or that question with the question around incentives. Let me try to combine these two. On implementation, I agree that we have a long way to go in terms of how do we implement ideas, especially in public agencies. But I will also say that our track record is not that different when you look at the private sector, right? But again, we view things through our own experiences. In the private sector, when a project fails, there's also money that's been lost. In the private sector, when things fail, there's also reputations damaged. There's also individuals getting upset, right? So I would caution us from saying that we do that more in the public and less in the private. I think it's equal, at least in the examples that I know. What I think is different is in the private sector, there is an understanding that failure over time in a well-reasoned, well-articulated strategy will eventually lead to some new discovery. And that's why failure is okay. In the public sector, we view things in the lens of a project. And every project needs to get done. And this is what I would like to focus on. We need to think beyond a single project, because an agency, right, every employee works on projects. And if they fail, we immediately say the project failed. But if you accept that the project failed, did the organization win? That's the question to ask. And most of the time, the answer will be, yes, you did learn something that advances the next project. It's the same in the private sector. If we scrutinize every project is a failure. It's very hard to design a project today that's going to achieve all the goals that we had when we designed it. It's just nearly impossible. So what we need to do is change the conversation around incentives, and especially on the issue of if an employee has an idea but the manager doesn't care about it at the time that the employee had the idea. And this is a very common problem, and I spent a lot of time discussing this in the book, but it comes down to a very simple thing. If you think from, again, here I'll use the example of industry. Early on, companies went around collecting data from customers and then trying to innovate for them. As Christian noted and other speakers noted this morning, we are now moving to a model where we are co-creating with our customers. I think to break this divide between manager and employee or boss and employee, both individuals need to give a little bit, right? So the employee has to think, okay, what is my boss's problems? And then have to actually design ideas that are relevant. Otherwise, there's a lot of ideas. On the other hand, the manager has to have some foresight and say, okay, the idea may not be relevant right now, but do I want to invest in it? Might it be relevant tomorrow, right? And this is where, again, in public institutions, you have the luxury to a certain degree that your environments are a little more predictable, right? So an idea can be invested in that's not relevant right now, but it might be relevant a year from now, because ideas take time to grow and scale. In terms of your remark on the lab and the need to have many labs, I completely agree. But I also think before you create multiple labs, you have to allow one lab to grow a little bit. Because in this lab that is being launched, and I'm extremely excited about its prospects, the early days are going to be very challenging. The early days are going to be one of trial and error and revision and replan, and so it needs a little time to get its feeling, develop and articulate a process, right, that works for the lab, develop a process for collaboration with industry, and That needs a little time. Once that happens, then you have the opportunity to create other labs, because then you don't have to go through that same expensive but very important learning curve, right? Because if you create too many labs right now, everybody's learning and there'll be a lot of repetition. But if you allow your existing labs to have the space, to have the flexibility, to innovate and develop processes, once they have a little breathing room, you will have the opportunity to take those processes and try to launch them regionally, try to launch them in different domains. And lastly, the question on happy innovation. I think we need to be less critical about our own abilities to innovate and change. And the opportunity is huge for us to see the fruits of our innovation once we get ideas implemented. I know it's a struggle, I know it's challenging to see an idea through, but I think if we give some space, right, not a lot, because after all, we don't have a lot of space, but if we give a little space and be less critical on our innovation capabilities, right, you will have more individuals like the lady from Argentina say that Chile is advanced. Chile is not, I think there's a lot of areas where Chile is much advanced, right? And so if we give those opportunities some room to thrive and grow, I think the happiness issue will be addressed. With that, again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mario, and organizers.
Agradecemos la exposición y las palabras del profesor Kevin de Souza. Y ahora, tal como dice el programa, nos corresponde la hora de almuerzo. Primero les quiero pedir que devuelvan los audífonos, por favor, antes de retirarse. Y ahora le quiero dar la palabra a la señora María Elisa Bernal, que como dueña de casa tiene interesantes datos en el tema de almuerzo.
Miren, de aquí dentro de la CEPAL tenemos 3 opciones. Una cafetería, que es entre otras el Café Colonia, que queda saliendo hacia el lago, hacia el espejo de agua, toman a mano derecha y ahí en esa esquina, ahí hay básicamente sándwich y ensaladas. Luego, hacia el otro lado, hacia Alonso de Córdoba, tenemos el casino, y dentro del casino, en la parte de adelante, hay una parte que son como wraps y ensaladas, y luego el casino grande, en donde hay almuerzo con todo lo que quieran. Además de los que les pusieron aquí afuera, por Alonso de Córdoba, que ustedes pueden entrar y salir también por Alonso de Córdoba con la credencial que les dieron, está Animal y está una serie de cafecitos más pequeños, incluso Starbucks como a 3 cuadras. Pero aquí también tenemos esos tres lugares.
Y nuevamente vamos a innovar y vamos a lograr este milagro en 1 hora y 15 minutos.